개부지 쇼로 전에 삼루대 쇼침부도 대인나 고치만 마슈고 셰셰 뱀줘라 루주가와 전에 배 게시샤체 셔도 배배서 뱀줘라 디 배배데 고치다 개가 나시 동에 시세 수수 파마다 년년도 아니 사상한다 집부다 참아 동해를 땐도 타러 지면은 디다 저와게 레메도 삼세 동해를 땐도 타러 지 로베 마셔네 도마면은 이제 단다 동해요 마음반 등은요데 땐도 타래 탑시 유제를 교단 견을 때서 디세고도 삼공내네 디유샤제 루주 가와서 로주 봐도 배 공부시 this is perwas 디질람나
So the topic for this morning and for the next 2 Sundays is on the topic of the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, the 3 occasions when the Buddha gave 3 different set of teachings. So before I go to the actual topic, I thought of talking a little bit about some of the significant events in Buddha's lifetime. One is basically after he was born, the king, his father, really wanted to make sure that he remains within the kingdom and succeed his kingdom, lead the royal life. And so therefore he was married, he had also a son. But then, as you know the story, he decided to, seeing the suffering of death, old age and so forth, he decided to leave the kingdom and even his family behind. Usually, sometimes people misunderstand this event in Buddha's lifetime as an incident where the Buddha does not have compassion for his or love for his family. But this is not the case. This is not how the tradition understands it, because the Buddha saw or understood that there must be a permanent method of gaining freedom from the sufferings of life, sufferings of death, sufferings of sickness, which plagues us not just one lifetime, but for numerous lifetimes, since beginningless lifetime. So in order to find a permanent cure for suffering of sickness, death, and so forth within samsara, Buddha actually made the decision of leaving his family behind to seek the truth for salvation. So therefore, we must understand this as an act of great compassion.
No, tene lo tru kawache. Ting tu sam sheje ro kom japche. Tamade kusudu pe kyobuchaje. Kondu namgi tado chenge dab tende mi ngachi ora to tawas kande chido de deshe. Oh, ni de kornga yore, te kaso kansa nga yore. Te kusuya soya tondalia. Lo tu chin chadusa. Koran nele kengenge transon chituga. O digi tene shingbe bomele kia ma se kang tronse kia bomele nga che shelada tende tos pirosia sobuya soko yo adese. Ente se wama ko che tuga tende pidwa. Ente be ti she kusu soya tondalia. O be trading se sobu jagaina malisi num da chu tende che. Tende judo kornga tendam jute tenge towa 대대그 콘주 텔로게도와 다 쿵쳐마서 빼깔레 잡제 다 깔레 간게 시소 전다 두마소서 다이 샤샹가 좀 로스제 콘주 자가 사르나도와 배신도와 에 산제 좀 된데네 되네 구수야 söne ene 도스텔 배시에네 공잡이야 산제 코마토라 코마톤 다 최송고 삼 최송세 제도도자 니메 장송도서 가반도 콘주 르바침보데 tilishene abu koto de kondo konzo tronsado medoa tene ta sulishe awse ne kornga de korantowa namju roba singere to singere tende do konzo kawayo nasa konzo shena kawirisam konzo sarna do ne sarna pedoa odislan.
So the Buddha, after leaving his home, meditated for 6 years without eating and drinking, surviving on the bare kind of minimum food and drinks, and he became very thin, skeleton thin. But then it is said that he had 5 attendants as well while he was meditating, and while when his body became so thin and fragile and weak, there was another sadhu who knows about Buddha's quest and his practices, and he requested a village girl named Sujati to give Buddha nutritious food and to restore him to health, because that is what he would need for his final quest for enlightenment. And so this is exactly what Sujata did. He offered Buddha yogurt, and he also offered Buddha nutrients and other kind of services so that he can restore his energy and vitality back, regain his vitality back for clear thinking, basically. And it is said that when he did that, his 5 attendants lost their respect for the Buddha, because they thought like he was not able to endure his hardship, was not able to endure his austere practice. He basically gave his ascetic practice. And so therefore they left him in kind of disgust, in disbelief, and then they went to Varanasi. So it is said that when Buddha finally achieved the state of enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, he was looking for people to give his teachings, the insight that he newly found through his enlightenment. And he realized that his Hindu teachers, he knew them to be having like really profound intellectual capacity. He wanted to give it to them, but they have long passed. So then he thought of his 5 attendants, and they thought he saw some sort of karmic connection, and then he went in search for them, and that's where he met them at Varanasi.
Oh yeah, the Hindu Sarnath Pendu de Konzo Ngabute Nyamdo to what to Shina to what that to some name bushes. Oh, the Kodama Yongdoas Konzo Hakoche. Tanganzungaman Messias. Shab True Dani should get to the Shacho Ya Perose, there's a Messias, a true to the Pier to the Messias Nimanasi, Kuranzo. Kodama Deni Dona Durse, Labgo Ase, Deni Dona Durse, Tessa de Labgose, Labdo Kozo. And it treated Peduzas and Jichum de Sanke said, Siji Masone, Namza should enter the thing down to the key on journey, Shab to the tree Nimanashi Chedoa.
So it is said that then the Buddha went to Sarnath in search for his first 5 disciples. At Sarnath at the time was covered in forest. And then when the 5 disciples saw Buddha coming from a distance, they had a conversation among themselves. They said that, let's not pay respect to Gautama, Let's not, when he comes, let's not stand up, and let's not offer him, a cushion to sit as we used to do. Let's not wash his feet with, cleansing water, the kind of traditional respects that they used to pay. So they decided among themselves. So they said, we're not going to pay any of this respect, but when if he comes here, if he chose to come here, we're going to say, Gautama, if you want to sit, you can sit. So it is that then, the Buddha approached them when he came close to them. His aura, his majestic kind of aura, was too much for them to bear. And as soon as the Buddha came, they stood up. They cleaned his feet. They, offered him the cushion and paid all the kind of respect that they used to do.
Oh yeah. Oh, the next conzo shudwa. The Kerangman, the red color jabs, teachers. Diana Kusuduria, Shella, the she supposed to bear to Tendichik Doase. Name cut to the ships one answer, sure. And this I get some then, oh, Godamas, namji nashimara nga sanje sara yense. Ane rabdu chunga condition na ko tani suma de bache to se soade. Lu de ngeshi to bache lu le kala shida tene. Teche de akumar lu ya buche choku de se. Oh, tene aje double time bache te samne saya tonya koya ganga be tinde samutane te abude mendose. Ko mi chokse yomarwa. Dobanam Saju Tongshimba, Saju Tong and Shikajatuna Kakum Degra, Tegona Tego, and a collection. What in Rachel, Swade, me Mesike, Swade, Tanya Sumalon Chicha would essay, or Ting the Nada, Tanya Sumalon Chicha would, and Terransukanga Tendesha would essay, this one do teach Lana.
So then they had a kind of initial conversation, the 5 disciples and the Buddha. And the five disciples kind of reminded Buddha, you used to have a very deep ascetic practice where you were able to actually endure a great degree of bodily pain and hardship. But you have lost that ascetic practice because now you're eating nutritious food. You are vibrant. You're healthy, you're eating food, you're taking care of your body. So isn't this a case of you having lost your saintly ascetic practice? To which the Buddha replied that, I'm not like the former Gautama, I'm a fully enlightened person. I have attained the enlightened experience directly myself. And what I've found and what I want to advise my disciples is that we have to follow the middle way when it comes to treating our own body. Like the one way is not to undermine the health and vitality of the body by actually subjecting our body to austere ascetic practices so that we cannot even think properly. The other extreme is the extreme of sensual gratification, in terms of enjoying the 5 sense objects without any kind of limit, because there is no limit to desire, and that is also detrimental to one's own health. So therefore the Buddha said that the best way for spiritual practice is to choose the middle way.
Oh yeah, le longe le sobat zu kangal ko shenja shu chembu yora o de shenja shu chembu yodo zane sambana shin mandu de ene kondo saya da nyok da kangal yong yora dangwa de yong yora o tende yong da sa nga zu ne da le da longe de zu changma songora ta chi do dawa ji shenja shu chembu che ma re se de ne donghe ba ba ten ba o se de zo kangal samlo tan ya de ngara zu de shenja shetana ne donghe mangbo ji ya ge shi shi ge do a se de zo kangal de ta chi do shenji chakba che ne de mandi do ta che chakdang ge samlo shu chembu che na donghe mangbo ji yong de yora de do de zo kangal donghe wa pe dewen jung ne de shi bu ching ga zo samlo de ma re de kar so de ne donghe ba ba ten ba donghe wa ching ge shi ji re se So then the Buddha began his teaching, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, which is the first teaching. And here he taught his first disciples, we have tremendous attachment to our own body, to our own wealth, to our own dwelling places, because we think that by having this kind of attachment, it is going to give us happiness and joy. But this kind of attachment is wrongly placed, he said, because in fact, the body is source of great suffering. And so therefore, if we are generating tremendous attachment to the body, it induces more suffering. So that's why, the need to cultivate detachment. And that's why he said
he began by saying that this is the noble truth of suffering. This is the noble truth of suffering, meaning that this here, meaning the psychophysical aggregates, the five skandhas, including the body, are source of suffering.
Oh, yeah. Oh, this one, didn't do a public and bowels, and other tongue there, and this somebody. Don't watch and get it, touch the since I do so. And then I'm going to have to Tratane. Jump in there, and then we'll have them Miss Suga, Mago, Treasure Color course on, say, Trata in Sierra. Then there's a good Treasure Color, say, Chungo course and Ming the Tobra. The Gares, Color Coronation, saying, I have to check Sanjay somebody in Yamsola. This and that is share two stooges, Color Coronation, Coco, the say, Tondala, Treasure Color, say, Tambo Corson, say, we'll have them Miss Mago Corso, say. Oh, yeah.
So therefore, the Buddha said that since the body and since the not only our inner kind of psychophysical aggregates, but also the outer environment is a source of suffering, that we shouldn't generate so much. We shouldn't generate attachment. We shouldn't be attached to these things, because attachment becomes the source of suffering. So when the Buddha began this circle of teachings, it is said that a voice from the sky declared, which is basically considered to be the voice of the gods, declared that the Buddha turned a wheel of Dharma that has never been turned before, either by gods or humans. And so that's how these teachings happen to be called the turning of the wheel of Dharma, because the gods declared, because of this particular incident, where the God declares the Buddha turned a wheel of Dharma that has never been turned before by the gods or humans. And so it is also referred to as the turning of the wheel, because just as when a wheel is turned, the movement is passed from one spoke to the next spoke. Here, when the Buddha gave the teachings, that teaching is passed on to the next disciple, and the disciple, through virtue of understanding and practicing and experiencing the truth of the teachings, passed on to the next disciple. And that's how the turning of the wheel of Dharma happens.
Oh, yeah. Oh, this is the Liatine. On the country situation, no Jinjik Dramindra, Kewan Dramindra, Sangin Dramindra, Longevity Dramindra, and it, they were Dungan Yonge, and Dramindra, Keganasi Dungan Yonge, and it, the water of Sinatin, Jurja, Dungan Yukoge. There's a condition go resena. Oh, the Shandaji, one member session, Arazo, Nyawalata, Yida, Tondro Miliki, Tezukanga Session Marada. Oh, Dini Kunjum Pagbe Tembaos. The Kunjum Sagi Judy Karisne, Della Longe and Gang Kansatezoge. Any Nyamo, Chagdangi, Chagdango, Le Sangbutang, Yambasa, Le Sangbusa, but the Lani, Sangbundribu, Yang Yambasa, but the Lang Yambel, Yungo, the essay. Dini Kunjum Pagbe Tembaos, and did someone Jumsati, Shanda Sambutan, Yomare. So did Denge Kansatezoge. Any Chagdangi Wange, Nanzingi Wange. Chaknang Wange Lesa, Kidig Lesa, Teletene, Titu Yongora, Sungora. Tingaranzo send Delipa Chashana, Pechiti, Haku Yosere, Chita. Na, something on the Shuk Simpuki, and a Nala Chico, the Nal Chico, Shuk Simpuki, and a Kumakuya, the Messiah that is Yondera. Teletene, Tunga Yondera, Tubudo. Oh, Taganesi, because all Tanga Yabuche, me Yabuche, Mele Pantonga, was Samutane. Yeah, Lega Yabuche, Lobson Yabuche, Lea Busani, Jamato Yora. Oh, Sendinalia, Soso Kali Cam, the two conditions you go to Tinashi, Nikiwane Kiwa Cutie, Concertos of Leas and Yungurmado. Shandaji want me to teach any social Mares on Gora, and didn't consume public temples. The Kunjum Secretary, Led and Yamoni, Yamot and Yamong, Sabe, Chana, Lany, Resuta. Oh, yeah, teacher.
So that was the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. And then the question comes, where do these diversity of experiences come from? whether it is the experience of one's own internal psychophysical aggregates, feelings and so forth, or our experience of the external world in terms of its environment and so forth. Some of it giving rise to happiness, some of it actually bringing suffering and misery. Why do this diversity of experiences come from? And so to this the Buddha taught that it is not created by some creator God. It is not that somebody is actually forcing us to suffer or forcing us to kind of go through different kind of experiences, but rather it is because of own karma. So this the Buddha said the second round of the teaching is this is the noble truth of the cause of suffering, where the cause the Buddha identified primarily as self-grasping, which in turn induce craving and aversion, and because of which we engage in positive actions and negative actions. And based on our positive actions, we experience happiness and joy in the mundane sense, and based on our negative actions, we experience suffering. And this particular fact that we are responsible for our own experiences and no external agent is responsible is something that we can also kind of infer from our own experiences in this very lifetime. For example, if out of greed you wanted to have the strong self-grasping and you wanted so many things for yourself, so out of greed you can engage in stealing or even to the extent of killing and so forth, and based on which you suffer internally and externally as well, physically. But on the other hand, if you have a very good motivation of serving the community and you wanted to have a profession that would help others, and based on that, years later, you actually find yourself engaging in a work that is fulfilling, right, giving you joy and happiness. So these experiences are therefore, one's own doing. So one is the creator of one's own experiences. That is what the Buddha meant by this is the noble truth of the cause of suffering.
Oh, tene, di cheliane, tene di ina, tungenge shi chengenge, ju nyamo nga samsan chakpa dang dangwa chakdangi, xiangwa de chuni le saba di ju chigi yona, ju di zoya yore be, nga ra zu rangshin de chili yora. Nga samsa samlu shuk chenpo kiyane, nga jiji sheswan shenja shuk chenpo kiyane, tila tene tang nga zu konzu seya dang chik tende chakdang samlu de rangshin ki yode wari shora. Di mewa soya yore be sera, di yore ese. Di nang gokpa kwakwa tenpa wo se. Sem di ngan zin chungru tang, chakdang nipu di chungru tang yore ese. Sem korang rangshin di chakdang yunge tende chik ma re se. Sem di rangshin di wese wa tang ma chi re. Lubur ki kombe honge ne, kongdu tang nga ye da chato tuzo lubur wa re se. Di yundi, di nyungru tang yore, sem li ya chakdang ki xiangwa du mendo wa tang, nyuru tang ne. Ane di wange le mesange, che sem di nyamo ki takbe, tang do ya yore se, chakdang nyamo sen do ya yore se. Sem nyamo sewe ne di, gondu ra, gyudi kaksa su na, debu tunghe di yongya yomara. Sen di ni ngokpa pabwa tenpa so, di tunghe ki gyudi ngokpa yore se, di sungu yora. Di yoba di ko, ngokpa yoba di, pabwa kansa tuzo ka hako tupku re, tenpa re se, konzo tonga na shi tenpa re se. Nga ranzo ku rangshin re shi, di mewa soya mendu samsang se, samya di, tenpa ma re sungu yora. Di ni ngokpa pabwa tenpa o se de.
So then, the next question is, if the cause of suffering is our own karmic actions, which in turn is caused by afflicted emotions of desire, hatred and so forth, propelled fundamentally by the fundamental ignorance of self-grasping and so forth, can these causes of suffering be ever eliminated? because they seem natural. Anger seems natural, attachment seems natural, grasping to a sense of self seems natural. Can therefore the causes of our karmic actions which cause suffering, that is basically the defilements, can they be put an end? Can they be eliminated so that a state of cessation from the causes of suffering can be attained? So to that the Buddha said, yes, the cause of the cause of suffering can be put an end. That is the state of cessation, and that is why the Buddha, the third statement is that this is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, because all of these defilements, negative emotions such as hatred and attachment and the primary ignorance of self-grasping are temporary, and they do not taint the fundamental clarity or the fundamental purity of the mind itself. Mind, by its very nature, is fundamentally clear, lucid, luminous, and all the emotions, defilements are nothing but temporary afflictions created by our own conceptual processes, and so therefore all of these temporary afflictions can be exhausted or eliminated. So therefore the noble truth of cessation is possible.
아니 다들 간데스 토고래 고바 요나데 타비에 매버서야게 착당당 좀 매버서야게 탑시 요래 가려 요래스 어디 요래세 니네 람파부에 담바오세 동해 세벌 도사게 람 박베 담바 요래세 어디 가려스네 pena 박베 람이야라게 버서도 나길래 넘버 다바 셴라 처와체도 동해 망부신 거라 걔도 나고 거네 셴라 처와체라 중참마 치중가 셴라 소바 나긴 레 넘버 다바 양다베 나서라 양다베 레지타 르기 거네 셴라 처와 반에 펜바주에 요라 자 양다베 레지타서라 양다베 소와스 륜가니가데 넘버 다베 거네 메시게 해들 양다베 소와데 메시 약부세시 깨야게 셴라 처와 반 펜바주 텐데시 깨요라 양다베 소와세 로베 소와 멤버세 데버사 간주마지네 소와 멤버세 아니 대주 제는 예송 동일에 소부터 스탄도거라 어디네시네 양다베 따와스 양다베 똑바세라 나 삼상 나가주 삼번나시 라오에 나 텐데시 요 말레스 상면안에 개체슈데 소소 이바시 요 말레스 와 상면안에 개체슈 소소 단달 밀 서와지네 주바 텐데지 나지 요 말에 키란 나라주 노르지 삼고 나사 라오아 어디인데 람베오데스 박벨람야라 깨부터 꼼게나 아니 녀모 차단을 소바 녀모 좀 비세로데소라 데네 람박베 담바오스 야
So then, if the state of cessation is possible, because defilements do not fundamentally taint the basic purity or clarity of the mind, then is there a path? Is there a path structure that can lead us to this state of cessation? And then Buddha said, yes, there is a path that can lead to the state of cessation, and the path he initially taught as the Eightfold Noble Path. The Eightfold Noble Path, starting with, for example, if we refrain from negative actions of speech, such as not lying, such as not causing divisive speech, such as not engaging in idle gossiping and so forth, we are indirectly helping sentient beings. We are indirectly other people, but not harming them. And likewise from the body, if we refrain from killing, if we refrain from stealing, if we refrain from sexual misconduct and so forth, we are again benefiting sentient beings. And likewise, if we lead right livelihood that basically through body or speech does not actually entail harming other sentient beings, that again is a kind of a way of livelihood where we are indirectly helping other sentient beings. So if we engage in these kind of activities, then through these karmic actions, we gain freedom from the lower forms of the lower realms, rebirth in lower realms, and so forth. And then similarly, we can engage in higher practices such as the right view, where the right view here says, there is no such self which you think is the most important of all the selves in the universe. That is yourself, right? And even though phenomenologically we experience like that, in an objective kind of analysis, there is no such self. In fact, the very notion of a truly intrinsically existing self is conceptually imputed. And so in this way, the Buddha said that, through the Eightfold Noble Path, we can get to the state of cessation.
Oh, yeah. Ne le longe la so pa de so ge de tu tunge ge chu chi re se ta wa je sam ge wa de te jun du de tunge ge chu chi re se shi nam sha ti che a da de ya ni ju yo re yo ma se ju nam sha ti che ra ani ju de se yo re yo ma o de se yo re se be thap shi yo re yo ma re se na o de yo re se tunge ju me so ya di shi nam sha ti so do wa ti chi la na.
So therefore, when the Buddha was teaching about how there is suffering in the world, and even what we ordinarily experience as happiness is also in the nature of suffering, because they are by nature impermanent and temporary and changing, and so therefore it eventually kind of causes suffering. And that suffering can further be the cause of suffering that can further be eliminated. So when Buddha is giving these teachings, he's fundamentally dealing with what is called as teachings pertaining to the basic ground or the basis.
Oh yeah, that ne dunge shebar cha ase, that the dunge ne lu longe la soba, ngaranju sogi pumbu choan dushi la soba. Teso de yabu jaha koko rese, dunge shebar cha ase, ro. Oh, the condition was in it. The ne lu longe la soba, socially we sobo, sem choa la soba teso kangate. Midag bare songora. Ko keji ki goran donge. Judan kenge onge. Ngarazo somebody sine, somebody tete wato, chi juan, nagin juan la soba, shibachil tejin delne, and somebody degi ora. Ngarazo samle nal karosna, ngangema ne ye, tanda ye, bade, maumbar tengereji, tangzin to a tunjin sira. Nime di tanda tirare, tanda dingema yo samsa tengi ora. O di kangade, midagware sonde, so de, somebody tete, midagware, keji ki judan ken teni ande ki ordas. Langzu rejino, lochunju reji, langzu reji, shencha yungoranga. O dia ko midaware das, keji ki gebe chos pandu ordasa. Itina shi penju pusun sobre sine ko de deve shushere, so kuba kaga ndre ki tire dasa ro. O tina shi so dia ko chiwe chondare. Pusun soba kangan debe chiyo na te takbari tinde de mardas nga jeche kengba cheche o takbari tinde te mare. Ti dendo shushere medabare kanga yaga chiyo na koe punzo yaga chune ko gyuro chinje mebre de ko chuni de diora. Se dezo kanga takba tembo rang takba tembo ani chi sosu lu da longju de kanga ngaranzo samlo nalbe tu takdu tengen samlo khodo. O di mare das di be de shushere das shenja de chongdu yora. Shenja de shukchambu yedo te da trend de tunge shukchambu yongu yora. So midagboda dunga sonde kashe ku tunge kan dunga she de samgora mare tunge de mev soya tundal midagboda tunge ore songora shebu yakbu yin samne shenja shuk chimbu ngora shenja shuk chimbu ne dunge shuk chimbu ngora trend de chujin de chunye de ore de midagboda ane dunga was, this some sora. That gave it dunga, never doing it to the young dara, Nazakura. Dewa in some sense to so kange you, kange the pa maybe capdelian, so get Dewa in some tire, which also some sword lumguara. Could the dong on Ezina, the Dagaden Dewa de Bedara Degora, the Judy son and Dewa de Devara Degora, the Devi Omara. Dewa in but is so lumne, Mijil Kale Reshivation, Nazareth Benanis, Casodeta, Dogder Skin, Kale Shivchuna. Dogder the papa of the Dozi, Dozi choose there you have the Desha Sonachera. And Dozi Luluseta, Ata was so sorry, Yabu, and did Dungo Susara. Sako. Narazu dunga de dunga tondru anje hakora. Dewa yin get to the ko so debachi unit tobam, kange unity, but zogbe kabdele, Dewa samsan so lomguduma do de Dewangone and de Dewa de Ranja deora, Kadu in a Teve, Judy Sansan, but the Dewa deora, the Devi Omara, just a dunga was. Midabata dunga or the Samtara, Nazu Tangzin Yore, any bit the Venjuneri Samutanga, Tabarite, or Dimares, Kangan June. Medawada dunga or is this Samutangura. This Samutan Shenja de Chundura. Shenja de Chundura, the trend to do it, Dunga de Chundura. Teach them, Mount Asa.
So then that was the first round of the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, basically demonstrating the basis or explaining the basis or basic ground. Now, at the second round of the teachings, the Buddha began by saying that the noble, earlier in the first round, the Buddha said, this is the noble truth of suffering. Now, in the second round, the Buddha began by saying that the truth of suffering should be realized or understood. And that basically means that, even though the fundamental basis is that, samsara is by nature in the nature of suffering, we do not actually realize it. So we have to make the effort of actually realizing that, our existence within conditioned life is, or samsara is by nature suffering. And that applies to our lifespan, our wealth, our youth, all of this, like they are by nature in the nature of suffering. And the fundamental reason why this is the case is because of impermanence. Everything is subjected to momentary change. So even though we cling to a notion of a permanent sense of self, in fact, what the reality is, we are changing physically and mentally from moment to moment. But we have what we call as confusion of three times. So we actually conceptually merge our past and the present and the future, which is a conceptual merging, not actual merging. Actual merging can never take place. So this is also referred to as confusion of three times, pertaining to the three times, or merging the three times. So then, sometimes we might wonder, if samsara is already in the nature of suffering, why do teachings or teachers need to remind us again and again of suffering? Isn't it like adding to suffering? So the answer is no, because the teachings on suffering and the teachings to realize suffering is to help us minimize suffering, to help us eventually gain freedom from suffering altogether. The point of the teaching on suffering is basically, if we are too much attached to a notion of things being permanent, whether it is our youthfulness, or whether it is our lifespan, whether it is our wealth, whatever it is, if we are attached to thinking that these are permanent, we wanted to hold on to them, that caused tremendous suffering. When we eventually we believe the reality that they are impermanent. So therefore, when we generate detachment by knowing the actual reality, which is the momentariness, as opposed to a kind of a conceptually misconceived reality, which we think they are understand them to be permanent and then lasting, then that kind of changes our experience, ourselves, our universe, and therefore we are able to actually kind of like let go of things, and we are able to actually therefore establish mental happiness and eventually get rid of suffering altogether. So therefore, in the second circle of teachings, when the Buddha said the noble truth of suffering has to be understood, it is basically introducing to the nature of suffering within samsara. Even what we call as happiness in samsara is actually relative. That we actually experience happiness is also in the nature of suffering, because they are also subject to change. And it is also kind of relative in the sense that it is not ultimate happiness. For example, if something is a source of ultimate happiness, it should give us lasting happiness. But nothing in samsara does that. It is likened to someone who is carrying a very heavy load, and then walking, and he kind of takes a temporary rest by taking off the load. But in that moment, he thinks it's happiness when he's kind of when he takes off the load. But it's not actually happiness. It's just absence of more intense suffering.
Yeah. Oh, they do carsoda. Ngadu Medawa Sambutan Dusa, Pusum Soban is a Karayuna Sosolia. Oh, the Tama de Tawa de Amare, Titsone, the younger years, some Satambayina. Koya Punzo, Sama, Tadelaco, Kubachamato, Yama, the Chuni de Ora. Oh, the younger years, some Medawa de Samlacone. Ned and Ludan Longi, John de Valasobara. So. Sambujan Tea, they attended in Sambina, Tawa de Me, Sambina, Chua de Yane, Yam the Tambaina, Shinja Chun do Yora. Kanla Chu Yam Simba, Kanla Neba Yujo. The Jipa Shena, Kasu, Jipa Cher Drea, to me Cher Drea, to the Shavio Mara, Tango Samutan, Tangzin Shutane, to Buddha Torgi Orde. Medawa de Yane and the Samutambina, Chua Medawa Samutambina, then to Dangame, Man, some Samlocora. Oh, they do Kanla Chuniam Simba, Carsere. Then it's Jiba Yondan. Shenda Kan Jigma Resere. Toma de Loco Chua and Jigma, Jiba Meba Sweat on Dalia, Medawa Samutagiora. Oh, Tanda Tire, the tea in Gurisana, could Tiba Pangere, Kawatu Gire, Messi Desir and Sumbus Desir, Yakusa Messica with some Jagiora. Oh, tea in the Chua Medawa Samutadi. Jiba Tambo Thomas was Combeonge. Lola Medea, you get it, in a co, Tia was a Samutaba Samutambena, so low children draw. To me, children do it. Oh, this little young use and young man, some Hako de Ora. The man at Tobiaco Jarachi, Meverage, Shivas Junsu, some Galia, Shanda Suji Majung Alachunsa, and December Media, donation do tender some Gora. The name is Susu Samlina Levan, oh, this junior is Tambone, this day and with this day with some Gora. The Medawa Samutambateco, you and then you use some Yorda. Teach you.
So, our reflection on how everything is in the nature of suffering because of their momentariness, because of the impermanent nature, is actually being practical. It is not being kind of pessimistic. Because and realistic as well, because if we initially, when we listen to teachings like this, it creates a sense of uneasiness, and that is because we have so much clinging to a notion of permanence. We wanted inherently out of habit, we wanted things to endure, things to last forever. So that's why when we receive teachings on impermanence and the suffering nature, we have some sort of easiness. But we can eventually overcome that. And the reality is that the teachings on impermanence and suffering actually helps us cultivate not only like objective kind of outlook towards the world and ourselves, and therefore a real stability and mental happiness. but it eventually also helps us to kind of gain freedom from suffering altogether. In fact, it is said that whoever reminds herself or himself of the reality of death gains freedom from all forms of fear, and eventually the fear of death itself. Because if we dwell on the reality that we're going to die one day, death is impermanent, like life is impermanent, it kind of makes us open-minded. It makes us put things into perspective better. It makes us courageous, and therefore, if we dwell with this understanding again and again, then we will be freed from many of our own small problems that we think are important.
Oh yeah. Oh, Dinesh, that and Karso Midawa Samlatanduko. Jiba Mavich Chagdo, Kochama. Mets a number of hours again to do. Shanda Kanako, did the younger son coaching some sort of Gudwa. And this Shivala and Jigmaro, the mets a number of hours a carry, Kochiwa de Chuniri, Jawando, Yakuji mother, Nason Care, Mass, a touch of Sosalia, down the Shinye or no. Oh, teacher.
So therefore, with access to teachings, if you reminded yourself of death and impermanence, and then you would naturally lead a life that is fulfilling and beneficial to oneself and others. And when we live a kind of purposeful life like that, reminding yourself of death and impermanence, then when the death actually happens, you will be able to embrace it with some sort of contentment, no regret. So that is basically one way to gain freedom from the fear of death.
Oh yeah. Oh, the Induta, Dunga was some of the Karesnera. Dunga was some of the Oh, Jenny Koe Dunga, Dunga, Dundu and Jahakon get some of the Nazahakura, the Dungere Samra. Tanda Tewa is and get to Zangazu, Tewa long, but Tewa dea could Junduera. Dungang Jundudo. Yabuda Chuna, Oda, Yabuchon, some day said the little Yabuta to Degmara, could Junduza, to make Yungura. Said Koe Dewa dea could Junior Dungang Judo, and Jure Dunga Segura. Teacher. And then it's also Lydia Dungaji Tensigura. Gaba, now the Chokan, so would Dayangora. Samutanda, Sorag Dunga Tensigura. I did do my so Samutana, so Migi Sociara. Sugi Pumbu to make you order, Soage, Sordanga Channel, you did Sordanga Channel to make you order, Samutanda Channel to make you order, Samutama Shera, Dushi Pumbus, and the Chagdang in Dushi Pumbu, or Tezulten to make you order. So Luda, Semda, Sorodan, Dushi Kanga, Samutanda Madini, so Migi Social order. Luigi Dungezuko, when a young girl, Semjanya Maride, taken a Samutanda, Sorada, Tendation to Mesosora. Oh, Tezuya, Samutana, Tungajiran Shinchere, Sandako, Shenja de Shukshondora. Shenja de Shukshondora in Aniko, Nayed and Kemba that is Chondora. Shenya Dunga and then a Goya Trabaseva, similar to Conandams. Oh, Tashira, Kowasankitimone, Yaudemendo, some Satindicia, some Nayed and Chiki Aborigin and Nayed, Kemba, Chado, that Tindeshira and Wilmara. Goya Trabaseva says. Nage Melchara. Coabal and Yinzi, Shanda Ganga Sosan and Sigba, some Dungajiran Shinchere, some Messitoede, Yaburis, Sony Yaburis, and Chamba, and Sewat, and they are pay Junduramato, Chado, Dan Chipsea, Nambachi, some Kumara. Coabal and Yinzi, Gela Kashi, Tilanzams, Gawadruel, Shan Pamba Trueda, never shared to supply New Yundura. I did what this was a call Dunga Samutamba Degi. Yuan you are raising Gora, Shan Dunga Yuan Dennis. Nanju Dungas to Tujara Shibisi Yomar. Dunga Samlutana, Teletan Yuan Den Yosova. Shan Dunga Yuan Dennis, Joe was Corbal and Yiziki. Gela Kashi, Dylan, say. Oh, teach you lesson. So,
that when the Buddha said the noble truth of suffering should be understood.
Dunga Delia. 다들 예배소에 뭔지 그 랭뉴지 상황에 대용 것도 뭔지 그 소소 때마다 강가셔야 돼 레도 nhiệm 가르 거고 저마다 소소 상반에 주는 거 말로 대해서 당도 다들 예배소에 대해서 봐 뭔지 그 랭뉴지 상황에 봐 소보다 섬다 좋아도 강가 아데스
when the Buddhist teaches that the noble truth of suffering should be understood, he doesn't only refer to the suffering that we ordinarily understand, what we, in the technical term, what we call the suffering of suffering. That is also a suffering that is even animals can understand, like physical pain, a mental kind of pain, something like that. That is something that even animals can understand. But here, the nature of suffering goes a little deeper, and we are asked to even see that what we actually consider happiness ordinarily are also source of suffering. And that is basically, momentary happiness, joy, they are also in the nature of suffering because they are not lasting, they're impermanent. And when in the absence of them, we actually suffer. So that is basically what is referred to as the suffering of change. And then there is the third suffering, what we call as all-pervasive suffering. All-pervasive suffering basically refers to the fact that, so long as we have the mind-body complex, we have tremendous potential to suffer because of having a body, because of having an ordinary mind. Or the fact of having ordinary skandhas or 5 psychophysical aggregates is referred to as the all-pervasive suffering, which basically is the mind-body complex. So, for example, we have a body, if we get ill or we get sick, then we suffer. And then we have, in terms of mind, the sensations, the feelings, right? Even though, we think that the kind of feelings and sensations, it's wonderful, but they are also cause of tremendous suffering. We like certain things, we discriminate certain things as good or bad, and based on that, we react with aversion or craving, and that induces tremendous suffering, not getting what we want, and so forth. And similarly, the act of discrimination, not just the feelings, but the act of discrimination, discriminating conceptual interpretation of our experiences as good or bad. That also induces tremendous sort of suffering. So when we are reminded of suffering, instead of actually suffering more, we are made more realistic, and we are made to actually being observant of karma, and therefore we are also made to actually empathize with others. So these actually eventually help us to cultivate inner joy. So it is said that when we actually dwell on nature of suffering, first of all, it eliminates our pride and ego. Secondly, it helps us to empathize and generate compassion for others who are also suffering. And thirdly, it reminds us not to engage in negative actions, knowing that the suffering that we experience is because of negative actions. It also helps us to encourage engaging in positive actions that help oneself and help others.
람법에 템바오스도 검자들 람데셰베 거스 검기어라 이내 단단가주 동해 템베땡기 남바데 삼부타들 시송도 메다바 동해와 동아 다메바시 다메바세데 소수 류다부치리아 야 소수 내다 롱주도솔라 롱셴겐게 라오에 다메바 나세 라오아치 삼부타 아니 나의 류세 나의 지지지세 나도 수차르제 셴샤제제 파 징게요도 nga rawa mewa nga rawa ke ngayo che soso tan dai me be mande che te den ge sam ko go ra o je da gi was nga ju sam ban na shi tin de mewa shi da tension de ba ju da yue ba ra tene takwa sami tayo. Nga zu namgyu samba nashi, nga si sobu paasha, sem paasha, tsoa paasha, tezu le takbu chengeri chi, wang gyungeri, di ngayri, ngayri, di ngayji chi chi, shuk chenpu chengeri chi wara. O di meba di songu towa, di pide dine lampagwe tenpo si, lamde kongbe kapsu konggi wara. O tanda samlu tansa ke shidele ya, mida dungi tonga dames. Rangwe ta meba, rangwe longzhu meba, rangwe ne meba, lu meba, longzhu meba se. O tinte samlu tanga ro. Tita, o tinte shara mero.
So then, when the noble truth of suffering is discussed or taught, it is taught as having four features. Feature of impermanence, feature of suffering, feature of being empty, and feature of being selfless. And Dharma or selflessness here means at this level of teachings and in the Four Noble Truth, having no independent self. Because usually when we actually experience the world, we inherently, intuitively experience an independent self. And we think that the things that the self enjoys, what is referred to as mine, are also independently existing, whether it is of friends or wealth and so forth. And that kind of attitude generates tremendous suffering, as we discussed earlier, because there is no enduring independent self. And so therefore, the other side of the coin is, during the discussions on the Noble Truth of the Path, selflessness would be discussed extensively, because inducing the notion that, or the realization that there is no permanent independent self, that what we call self is a kind of conceptual imputation based on the psychophysical aggregates, will relieve us of our attachment and suffering.
No, then this is now. The Congress, Colosungna, Colotomatilla, Simzambelu, Shishachi, Luci Shishachi, Shane, Abdua Tisha, Sierra. Oh, in the Colotan book of Sanjaki, in the Chiru Yuba Sungiora, Chiru Yuba, Chilogi, Suda, Teru, Rexala, Sobatezo, Simzamba said it, Message Yora. The Chirogi, Suda, Teru, Rexala, Sobatezo, Kanga. Yeni tiki miki cheneni shebake teleteni soate duke o yabundo to budo samsake tishe chiru yobase sungora o daganashi shu tamjen disama togbe pa tagbo samare rangune yorese di rangune mere sunguyo marte di kolo dangbe ko shu tamje rang chengi yoba ngaraza tonanashi shagiyore chiru yobase chiru yo semle losu yo pinetsu number 10 soate duke Tisama Yosungora, Chesandi, Colotangbuti, Dodibata, Chitama, Tutama, Shin and Kuni Lu Shishache, Shisha, Dancer de Tiltingora, Chiru Yose, Chutam Jaranga Sini Yose, Tamida Bada, Dungawada, Tamiba said, Tami Rakbachi Shora, Tisha Yora, Dodibata, Chitama, Tutela, Damani, Chiru Yabama Sura. Chutam Jaranga Sing Yava Mas, or Konzo Kunto said, Colotambula Ten, Tutaniti, Kunto Yungora. Oh, this is Angeles.
So, just to contextualize the Noble Truth or the teachings on the first teachings on the Four Noble Truths, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, this, according to the meaning or the import of the Samthi Nimocana Sutra, or the Gongdel, the intent of the scriptures, scriptural commentaries, to the Gongdel, the first turning is geared towards the first two philosophical schools, the Vipassika school and the Sautrantika school, or Buddhist philosophy, who actually possess the existence of external reality, external phenomena, as opposed to the mind-only school, the Chittamatra school, who actually does not possess the existence of external reality. The external reality for the mind-only school is nothing but reflection of your own mind. But for the first two schools, which this particular turning of the wheel of Dharma is intended. They not only actually possess the existence of external reality, they also possess that things do have their own in self-characteristic or self-nature. So therefore, at this level of teaching, they teach. The Buddha gave teachings for beginners, basically assuming that things have their own independent characteristics or features, and the selflessness that is taught here is kind of gross selflessness. Not the selflessness in the emptiness sense that will be taught at the later higher philosophical schools, but the selflessness here is a kind of gross selflessness, meaning there is no kind of independent self. So time is up. We're going to stop here for this morning.
Yeah.
May all beings have happiness. May they be free from suffering. May they find the joy that has never known suffering. May they be free from attachment and